Well, good morning. How many people have never seen me without a beard? Of course, some of you. Okay, got two in the front. Kramers, you've never seen me without a beard, have you? Did you know who I was? You didn't know who I was, did you? When I started growing the beard, you know, that was 1 year and 7 months ago. I started growing that. I was on we went with my son on a cruise. He said, "I want you to go with us with the in-laws and the outlaws or whatever on a cruise." So we went and, you know, I had 3 weeks out of the pulpit, so I thought, well, I'm just not going to shave, and I never got back to it. I mean, it's nice saving 5 minutes every morning, you know, when you get up. So at any rate, we had a military dinner last night, so I had a choice to go to the military dinner in a regular suit, coat, and tie, you know, and they scolded me last year when I showed up like that with my beard, so I thought, well, they always like to see you in your uniform, so to put the uniform on back, I had to get rid of the beard. So at any rate, I'm Pastor Gary. Welcome to the church this morning. Oh, and I'm sure I'll hear my comments coming back and forth as to who liked the beard and who didn't, you know. So we'll keep on going and see how it goes. Anyway, I had a picture. Maybe we'll show it some point later on. Of me at the military. Oh, there it is. That's us at the military dinner last night with Dad. That's the dress mess blues that you wear for a military dinner. And then Lois and Dad, of course, being a Navy vet, went, so it's really kind of neat to be there. So, at any rate. That's what happened to the beard, if you want to know. But we're in the book of Mark, and actually related a little bit to the military. I don't know, how many of you are on-time people? You know, you need to be there on time. How many people are there, you know, I'll go, oh, yeah, I see somebody putting someone's hand down. How many people, you know, hey, if you're there 3 minutes late, 5 minutes late, you're on time. How many people are like that? Okay. Jonathan's like that, you know. I'll tell you, my worst nightmare in the military was oversleeping in the morning and missing a formation, you know. I mean, especially when you're a chaplain, you know, and an officer and you're supposed to be there, you know. I remember one meeting, the commander always said be there 10 minutes early for the meeting. So you're always there 10 minutes. One day I had somebody asked me a question, I got a phone call, whatever. I was 3 minutes early for the meeting. And once you know, that was the one day they started 5 minutes early. And I was the only guy walking in there. He was looking, you know, there's the chaplain late for the meeting and all kind of thing. And it's just, it's a mess. And Jonathan was one of those that tested us. I mean, he was kind of like, I'll get there when I get there. I mean, Jonathan, when he was at school, he had it down that he could sleep to about 3 minutes to 8, jump out of bed, throw on some clothes, run from his dorm to the room where his class was, get there at 4 minutes after 8 because the class started at 8 o'clock, but you weren't late till 5 minutes after 8, you know? That's the way he was. And he would test us, you know? I mean, come on, Jonathan. I don't know if you ever get upset, you know, but that's if I get upset or uptight, it's when I'm going to be late for something, you know? For instance, I'm home and, you know, we got to leave. And normally I'm here like 8:30 in the morning, so it's not a problem for this service. But if it's a service in the evening, say like a Maundy Thursday service at 7 o'clock, you know, and so the whole family's coming with me at the same time, you know, we're trying to get here 20 of, quarter of, and then someone's not ready, and we're going to be late, you know, and I'm the pastor, you know, I can't be there 5 minutes late. I've got to be there on time. You get all nervous and kind of thing, trying to get there. Well, today we're going to look at two miracles that involve the Apostle Peter, and we're going to look at the Apostle Peter for the next few weeks through Lent and through at least Easter and probably a few weeks beyond that. And we're not going through all the books that have to deal with Peter. And of course, Peter was a disciple. So there were a lot of times when Peter was involved in things, but we're looking at only the passages where it specifically mentions Peter as saying something, doing something, or whatever. So today we're going to look at a double miracle that takes place because we're on the way to one miracle when another one takes place, and Peter's involved in both of those. We could, if you wanted to, look at the book of Mark in a way because the book of Mark was written by Mark. But Mark was kind of like a disciple of Peter, real close to Peter, and so we think that Peter influenced a lot that happened in the book of Mark. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and it's kind of like the important word in Mark, depending upon whether you use the King James or another one, is either immediately or straightway. It's like immediately we're here, and immediately we did this, and then straightway we did that. You know, it's just boom, 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 and it's the shortest one. Because he's trying to get, you know, like this is, you remember that old one, you know, just give me the facts, you know, that's what it is, just the facts, you know. And so it was kind of the shortest book. So we could follow that for Peter. But it's interesting, like in today's passage, Peter is involved and makes a comment at one of these. We'll point it out. But in the book of Mark, which Peter probably had the most influence, and Mark wrote it from Peter's perspective, quite possibly, Peter's comment's not mentioned. It's attributed to all the disciples, or the disciples were thinking this, and he's not specifically mentioned. And I don't know whether sometimes he's not mentioned in Mark because he's a little embarrassed about whatever he said and did, or maybe he doesn't want to make himself look like, hey, I'm this great person, if he happened to do something good. But it's not always in the book of Mark that Peter's mentioned. Sometimes Mark just skips right over his comment or mentions that he's there doing something, and it's Luke or Matthew that brings it out. So at any rate, we're going to look at the book of Mark, and we're going to be today I'm going to look at the book of Mark for this particular episode, because as we look at this particular two miracles, Matthew only takes, let me take a look here, Matthew only takes 9 verses to describe these two miracles. Luke takes 10 verses to describe these two miracles. Mark, which is the shortest book of them all, takes 23 verses to describe these two miracles put together. So we're going to go through the book of Mark this morning. We're going to look at Mark as we go through this. Mark chapter 5, if you'd like to look at there, and pull out your inserts. All you have an insert in your bulletin. If you want to pull that out, you can take some notes, and it'll kind of help you keep on track with what we're doing. If you've pulled out that insert, I want you to take a look, first of all, at the colored part down the bottom. I'm just going to throw this out in the beginning. Some of you are interested in this kind of thing, and some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. We'll introduce you a little bit. But how many have ever heard of the DISC personality profile? Anybody heard of DISC? Okay, a couple of people. It's up in the top left-hand corner of what you see here and on your notes. It's DISC, and basically this has been around for a long time. I first came across it with the second column when LaHaye brought it out. LaHaye was a Christian writer, and he talked about 4 different kinds of personalities. There was the choleric personality, the sanguine, the phlegmatic, and the melancholy. And each one had a different type of trait, and you can kind of categorize yourself. And I was like, 80% choleric in LaHaye's thing. And then Tim LaHaye also took those, and he talked about, first of all, it was about temperaments, and then he had spirit-controlled temperaments, and he talked how they related to some of the people in the Bible. And this came along, and lo and behold, they have 4 traits. And their 4 traits kind of match the ones that LaHaye had. And it's dominance, influencing, steadiness, and compliance. And so as you look at these, the dominance is the guy, he's out there, the visionary kind of person that's kind of normally is taking the charge. And, if you got a group of people sitting there on a committee, that's probably the person that's going to jump in there and say, let's do this kind of thing. The influencing person is the party animal. Everybody loves them. They know people. They get along well with people, and they can influence people in different ways. That's the influencer. Caleb's probably an influencer. There's the steadiness one. They're the person you can count on. They're there day and night. They just do things and they're just there. They don't look for a lead role a lot of times. They're just, they're the people you can count on. And they're just kind of behind the scenes sometimes. They can be a leader, but they're just, if you're calling them a leader, just know they're going to do their job and be going on. And then there's the compliance person. This is sorry, Richard, this is probably the engineer, and I'm a DC, so I've got a little bit of compliance, and it's kind of funny because the D and C sometimes don't get along very well, because the D says, hey, let's go do this, let's conquer the world, this is my vision, and the C says, you can't do that. There's only $375 in the budget to do that, and you've spent $374, you can't do that. It's the compliant person, or we're going to change. We're going to start the service next week at 10:30. Well, you can't do that. We've started at 10:15 for the last 3 years. The rules say. So it's the rule giver. And so forth. Follow the rules, and they're necessary. They try to keep us on track sometimes. And I wind up, I say, I'm a DC, so I kind of I'm a kind of a odd person in the sense that I go against myself. I can do the details of the big vision, and not very many people do that. There's not very many people can get the big vision, but also get all the details right and look at the details and are concerned about it. They let that to the bean counters, you might say. Then Smalley and Trent came along, and they do a lot of marriage counseling. Smalley has a bunch of books out on marriage counseling and stuff. and they used 4 animals to describe him. So the dominant one was the lion, he's the king of the forest. The otter is the little slithering thing, if you've ever seen an otter at a zoo, they're kind of the playful animal. They're always doing they're going around, they just don't care, they just kind of having their fun, and that's the otter. And then the golden retriever, that faithful animal, always by your side. He just there all the time. I love golden retrievers. And then there's the beaver, that's always busy building the dam. Everything's got to be exact right, and so forth. And so they use that person. And then some of them take the characters and say, well, there are certain Bible characters that fit these parameters. And so Paul is the one they typically say will fit in the dominance one, or the D role, or the cleric, or line, whatever you want. Would be the one that would be similar, that I kind of relate to a lot of times. And actually they say he was a DC, and that's probably true, because he was the visionary one, wanted to do a bunch of stuff, but he was kind of a lawyer. You read through the book of Romans, and the just shall live by faith. He had it down, everything. It's really logically laid out in the book of Romans, and I love the book of Romans, and maybe sometime we'll go back and study that. But that's Paul. And they just throw Peter into the influencing, and they call him an influencer, but also a D, because he kind of takes leadership in some of the stuff later on. He's kind of the out front guy, but he's the influencer, and consequently, the party animal kind of thing, and he's always opening his mouth, and speak first and think later, Sometimes that was Caleb also, he'd be able to throw something out there and say something, and they just very verbal, and that's the way they went. Steadiness, they look at Abraham as being probably the steady one of the characters of the Bible, and then Moses as being the compliant one. Why do you think Moses? 10 Commandments, right, the law. He wrote the law, here's the book. Anybody read through the book of Leviticus? It's just law after law after law. Now, they came from God, but he was the lawmaker, and he had everything down right. So they kind of put him in there. Now, you say, why are we looking at this? Well, I thought it'd be interesting to look at this at some point, and today's sermon just seemed to be the place to put it. It didn't fit in last week's, and I thought, well, it'd be a nice way just to kind of start it out. So I like this thing. It's kind of interesting. I am not good at this personality kind of stuff. It took me years, and I think I finally got disked down, where I understand it a bit. But when I first started, Lois was the one. I'd go to her, what are those for again? What's a D, And how do you handle those? Because she was pretty good at that kind of stuff. But where this comes in really well sometimes, and it's really it's useful in your business, in your school, in your teaching, any place, because if you know which personality you are, sometimes it can help you, one, to know where your strengths are. It can also sometimes help you know where your blinders are, where you're going to make mistakes. Like if you're a DI, a dominant person, but you're also an influencer, you might, go straight forward, and you don't have that C component, and you don't have anybody to reel you in and say, hey, have you considered that this is going to happen, if you do this? This is where the budget's going to be in 15 months if you continue on this track. Or do you know what your health, you don't have that compliance there. So knowing what you are, and usually there's like 2 characteristics. You have maybe a dominant one and a secondary one. It helps you just as you're dealing with people to say, I'm probably a D, or maybe you're a C. I'm a C. I'm a compliant. I'm always, I want to make sure everything's right, but I want to make sure the church is going right, or my business is going right. I want to make sure. I know another person has got their businesses in purchasing, and they got to make sure everything's there right at the same exact moment. That's a C kind of job, But allowing to a person who has a D personality to do their thing and be able to follow them through. So knowing these personality traits help. I brought it up because I thought it'd be interesting just to show you where some people place Peter as that influencer, and that's sometimes why you'll see him involved in a lot of stuff and talking out of turn, maybe, because he's just that guy. Talk first, think later, And he seems to be the influencer, and so I think last week we said, he was mentioned like 130 some times in the New Testament. Well, that's the guy that's constantly interacting with people. And that's what Peter was. So anyway, that's just an overview. If you like to look at personality traits and stuff, that gives you a little bit of an overview of where Peter might fit in, and maybe even where you fit in as we go along. But we're going to look at chapter 5. So let's go straight to the Bible and back to Peter's actions in Mark chapter 5. We'll start there, and we want to start with the first few verses here. And in Peter, we're actually looking as we go through this section into Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. And in 21, I'll read through these verses a little bit, and then we'll kind of look at them and we'll talk about them. Start with verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered around him, and he stayed by the seashore. Now, let me give you a little bit of perspective. If you look at the previous one, he's across the Sea of Galilee on the west side of the Jordan, the east side of the Jordan, the east side of the Galilee, and it's basically Gentile territory. That's where he went, if you remember, and he met the man who they couldn't keep caged up and couldn't keep chained up. He had demons in him, and they said, and Jesus said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Legion, because we are many." And Jesus Christ talks to him, and he says, "Well, come out of them." And he said, "We don't have any place to go. Can you send us into those pigs?" And so he goes into the pigs, and all the pigs run to the lake and drown. And then everybody gets upset, and says, "Jesus, leave here. You're hurting our business," or whatever. And so Jesus then gets in the boat. He goes across the lake, and that's where we pick it up here. He's just arriving on the seashore after having done that miracle and casting out the demons from across the lake. And so he winds up on the seashore, and one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and upon seeing him, fell at his feet and entreated him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her that she may get well and live." And he, Jesus, went off with him, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. Let's stop there. I call this an unreasonable request from an anxious dad. I want you to think about this here. As you look at some of these passages, let me just go back and talk a little about the synagogue first. The synagogue is not something you see in the Bible as you look at it, okay? The synagogue actually was back in, the temple was there, but the synagogues you don't find coming until later on. And people think, if you think back to our Ezra and Nehemiah series, think that Ezra was the one that started the synagogue. It was like the local place. So if you couldn't make it to the temple to do your sacrifices and everything, you couldn't do the sacrifices of the synagogue. But the synagogue was the place where you'd meet every week. And so it was like their church. And so that was probably established around the time of Ezra, they think, when Ezra came back from Babylon. And so he established it, and each synagogue had a board of elders, they were called. Okay, those that were the officials of that particular one. And the word used in this particular text says he was a chief official. So it would be like being the chairman of the elders of the synagogue. He was the head guy. Now, if you remember from last week, Peter was at that place called Come and Follow Me. But at that point, Jesus Christ had been in Galilee for a while. And he had made his headquarters there, maybe even lived in Capernaum. So this leader is from the Capernaum synagogue. And so he probably knew of Jesus. Jesus had probably spoken at that synagogue a few times. And so he knew who he was. Maybe he'd seen a miracle. We don't know if he'd seen any miracles of war, but he knew who the guy was. Now, at this time also, the leaders of the Jews were not very happy with Jesus because he was stealing all the thunder. And he was saying some things that went against what they wanted to say. And so Jairus had this kind of dichotomy where here's all these people of the religious leaders that weren't too hepped up on Jesus. In fact, he just got him thrown out of Nazareth. They just run him out of his own hometown, and now he's up here in Capernaum. But Jairus is the leader of this particular synagogue here. And as we look at some of these discoveries, they've actually found a synagogue in Capernaum, through excavations. They don't believe it's this one, but they believe it was built on top of the original one. And if you remember last week, they also found something linking Peter to that area, and they think that Peter and Andrew's home might have been just like, 100 yards from where the synagogue was. It was very close. So Jesus very well may have had constant contact here. So we have Jairus, who has a daughter. It doesn't tell you here in this passage, but if you look in Matthew and if you look in Luke, I'll have a few other things to tell you about, especially in Luke. Luke chapter 8, I think it's verse 42, tells us that she was an only child. So it was his only daughter. And secondly, she was about 12 years old. Now, 12 years old was kind of the age at which you were considered a woman and entering womanhood at that point in time. So she had just reached that age of being at that particular point. And Jairus comes and falls down at Jesus' feet in front of him. He had just gotten ashore. And if you can imagine, it says the crowds are there. So as soon as he gets ashore, there's all these crowds. Jairus probably is well known, almost for sure. And so he has no problem, I don't think, getting through the crowds. Make way, make way. And he finds Jesus, and he falls down at his feet. Religious leaders are not real happy with Jesus, but he's at Jesus' feet. Why? Because he's got a request. Can you imagine? I don't know if you're a parent, maybe you can. I guess I've been to that point with Jonathan, when your child's sick, so sick that you think they might die. Can you imagine Jairus? I mean, this is just some guy that comes there. I mean, I didn't even think of this until like 2 days ago. I'm thinking of the emotion of this. This guy has his only child, a daughter who's 12 years old, and she's on her deathbed. She's about to die. Can you imagine the grief in this father's heart? He's got one last hope, he thinks, because nobody else is able to help her. And he hears that Jesus just arrived on the shore. Don't know how far the synagogue is from the shore, but he runs down and he falls at Jesus' feet. And he says, and he talks to him and says, please come, because if you lay your hands on her, she will get well. He had faith. He had the faith that this would happen. What was his condition when he got there? I don't know. I'm trying to think. I'm thinking he's probably out of breath. Don't you think so? I mean, if your daughter's at home and you just hear that Jesus is there and you think that he can heal her, he's probably running as fast as he can, probably out of breath, probably crying, probably sobbing. Jesus, my daughter's sick. She's about to die. Please come to my house. There's a quote that one of the commentators, actually John MacArthur, said. He said this, and I think it's apropos. He says, often some great tragedy drives a person to Christ. The person who feels no need in his life has no hunger for God. Let me read it again. Often some great tragedy drives a person to Christ. The person who feels no needs in his life has no hunger for God. I've used the illustration, if you don't know you're drowning, you're not going to reach for the life preserver, You've had this person, you throw a little life preserver. Oh, no, I'm a great swimmer. I can swim. They're not going to take the life preserver, are they? And how many people do we know that just, you've talked to them about Jesus Christ, you try to lead them to Jesus Christ, try to share, but they just have no need. They've not gotten to that place where they have a real need for the Lord in their life. And sometimes it happens to us too, doesn't it? We just go along life's way, and we get active in our business as Christians, we get active in paying our bills and everything else. And I'm the same way, I've got a million things going on. It's funny because you go and you see people, oh, you're retired, because you retired from the military. Yeah, I retired from the military. I picked up about 5 other things, I probably won't retire till the day I die, at the rate I'm going. But, that's the way it is, oh, you're retired. Well, no, you got a lot of stuff going on in your life. And that's the way we can get sometimes. We don't realize that we need, all of a sudden, something happens in our life. Somebody gets sick. We find out that we've got an illness. We wind up with a financial thing that all of a sudden we can't pay a bill, and all of a sudden it stops and we start thinking about God again. I wonder how many times God sends those things in our life to remind us to put him first in our life. The principle I want to share with you this morning is this, on this first point. It's Jesus is ready to hear us when we are in trouble. Jesus is ready to hear us when we are in trouble. He's both available and accessible. Unfortunately, we sometimes do not go to him when we need to. We do not see him all the time, but he's always available and accessible. We just need to talk to him. The second thing we find here is starts off in the next few verses, and let's see, we're picking it up here now, probably at verse 25. Now remember, as we read this, here's Jairus. He's deathly afraid his daughter's about to go to die. He's got Jesus' attention, and Jesus is coming with him. There's a great crowd pressing in on Jesus. So it's not like Jesus is running to get to Jairus' house. All these people are around him. So I can you imagine how Jairus is here trying to, please make way. We need to walk, but Jesus is kind of, all the people around him, so they're just kind of slowly going up the hill or whatever it is up from the shoreline to his house. And Jairus says, I want to be there already. Let's get there. And then verse 25 takes place. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years. How old was Jairus' daughter? 12. As long as she's been alive, this woman's had this blood disease, this blood disorder. And she had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. Anybody feel the frustration of this person? You like that? You know, you have something wrong with you, and you go to doctor after doctor after doctor, and nobody seems to know what's wrong with you. And this is not a day when they have, oh, go get an MRI or go get a CAT scan. But even today I come across people that say, oh, I've been to so many doctors, I can't figure out what's wrong with me. Something's just wrong. Now, I kind of think it's fatigue, How many people are all tired all the time? Okay? I can't, it seems like a lot of us are always tired and we can't figure out what's wrong with us, Maybe it's just we need to lose a little weight, I'm not sure. But there could be something else wrong, There's always something that comes and this is where she had. And she had been to all these doctors, and the thing was she was now penniless. She had spent everything she owned trying to go to doctors. And did she get healed? No. She was, in fact, worse now than she was before she'd seen the doctors. So now she had seen all the doctors, she had no hope, and she had no money. And she was worse off than before. Verse 27, after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. If you look in one of the other sections, it says, touch the fringe of his garments. Now, if you look back in the Old Testament, you find that the men's clothes was supposed to have tassels on it. 4 tassels, one at each corner of the garment. And so one of the other says specifically she touched the fringe of his coat. So what we think might be happening is almost like you see here in the picture. There's this little tassel that's coming, and she doesn't want to draw attention to herself. She just thinks, if I can touch that, if I can catch the tassel, he's walking by. Now imagine, all the people are crowded around him, and she's trying to get to him. Have you ever been in a crowd and tried to get to somebody? Maybe a friend, or maybe you're at a concert. I don't know if any of you old people want to go to a concert. But you go to a concert and you say, I want to be able to see the performer. Maybe I can get to them, and you try to get to them, but there's such a crowd you can't get through them. That's what this was like for her. Everybody was around Jesus, and he's still moving that direction. She's got to go through all these people in order to get close enough to get down and just touch the fringe of his tassel in order to get healed. That's what she wants to do. Verse 29. She touched the fringe of his tassel, the fringe of his garment, and immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And immediately, there's that word. You listen to verse 29. If you're using the if you're using the New American Standard, it says immediately. Other words might be the straight way. Verse 29. And immediately the flow of blood stopped. Verse 30. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself. That's the words in Mark as he goes along. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeded from him, had gone forth and he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" He felt it. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? I'm thinking, first of all, Jairus is probably having a bird. His daughter is on her deathbed. There's all these people. He's trying to get Jesus to keep on moving toward the house. And all of a sudden he stops and turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And I'm sure he's saying, Jesus, the most important thing is let's keep going. It doesn't tell us what he's thinking, but I'm sure he's having just all kinds of pain thinking about this. She just wanted to touch his tassel of his garment so she'd get cured. And I'm sure as he turns around and stops and asks who touched her, she's shrinking back, hoping nobody notices her there. But as we read the power here, it says, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched you?'" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. He kept looking, it says, if you look at some of the other texts. And this is the passage that I think is interesting. This is Mark. Who asked him this question? That you see the crowd pressing on you and you say, "Who touched me?" Who asked him that? What's it say? Come on, you look at your Bibles. Who asked that? Verse 30. The disciples, right, the disciples did. But you look at the other scriptures, and you look particularly at the book of, I think it's the book of Luke, if I'm not mistaken. And guess who really made that question? Peter did. Now, Mark is the one that he influenced, but Peter really said that. And if you look at Luke chapter 8, verses 45 and 46, the parallel passages, this is what it says. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, everyone's like, "No, I didn't touch you. I didn't touch you." You know, and he's looking back. I'm not the one. You know, what's Jesus going to do? You know, he's going to complain that I touched him. Maybe he's going to, you know, kill me on the spot. I don't know. Yeah, who touched him? I wasn't me. It wasn't me. Everybody said, "No, it wasn't me." And then it says in Luke, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware the power had gone out of me." It's Peter the one that asked the question. It doesn't tell us that in Mark. He's the one that stops him, and of course, that's his personality, you know. And I put it this way. Let me read it to you. I put it this way. This is what I think Peter's really common saying. He's saying, "What do you mean who touched you? Everybody's touching this crowd. What a stupid question, Lord." You know? That's what he's feeling like. That's a dumb question. Look at all these people. What do you mean who touched you? And Jesus said, "I did feel somebody." It's like, Peter, you're wrong. Someone touched me in a special way. Just shut up, you know? I don't use that word, but I mean, that's kind of like, you know, keep quiet, Peter. Someone touched me. Now the woman's sitting there. She hears this exchange between Peter and him, and she says, "I'm going to be found out. I got a problem." And so she comes, it says, "But the woman, fearing and trembling," verse 33, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." Now, she'd already been healed, right? So what's it mean, God has made you well? Well, the word used here is sozo, which means it's S-O-Z-O. It's the word for saved. It's the word to be made whole spiritually. And if you look in the scriptures, that happens a number of times. Blind Bartimaeus, for instance, it says, "You will be made well." Do you remember the story of the 10 lepers? The 10 lepers went and they all got healed. And he said, "Go show yourself to the priest." So they took off. What happened? One came back. And he came back and said, "Thank you, Lord, for healing me." And what did Jesus tell him? "You have been made well." You see, I think the others were only healed. I think the one leper got saved. There was something special. And that's what we have here. She got healed, but it looked and said, "Your faith has made you well." She was not only healed physically, she was healed spiritually. She was made part of God's kingdom. And sometimes we get the things mixed up, you know. We want to see God do things for us physically, you know, and help me pay the bills and help me get well and help this person, you know, who's sick in the hospital. But we forget the spiritual healing. And that's the most important thing. And she had the spiritual healing. Now we're still back to Jairus. He's still having a conniption because this has taken a while now. While Jesus is looking around and everything, and he's thinking, "What's going on with my daughter?" Well, we don't have to wait very long because we look at the very next verse in verse 36, and it says, Jesus was still speaking to the woman, while he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue officials saying, "Your daughter has died. Why do you trouble the teacher anymore?" Now, before we move on to that, let me just add the principle that we have from this particular event as we look at this. And I put the principle I have from the lady is that interruptions can be great opportunities for God to work in and through us. Interruptions can be great opportunities for God to work in and through us. He worked in the lady who was healed and who was made well. But he also was working in Jairus' case. Now, Jairus doesn't think that because on the spot, the people come and say, "Your daughter just died. Tell the master not to bother coming. She's gone." Verse 36. But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken to Jairus, they didn't even tell Jesus, they overheard what was speaking, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." Now that suggests he was afraid. And if your daughter's 12 years old and on her deathbed, you're afraid, aren't you? And he said to him, don't be afraid any longer. Now, that seems kind of odd. You know, why would you not be afraid any longer if she's dead? You know, I would have been even more afraid now. But he says, don't be afraid. Only believe. So Jairus had to come with grips. Who's he going to believe? The folks that just told him, tell the master just to give up and not even bother coming. Or he's going to believe Jesus who says, only believe. So he goes, and I'm sure Jairus is thinking, boy, if he hadn't delayed, maybe we could have got him there in time. But they did. Verse 37, and he allowed no one to follow with him, this is Jesus, except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. So now we have this triumvirate, these three disciples that he lets go with him. Now, I don't know if they're getting into the house at this point. Maybe they're just arriving. And he doesn't let the crowd come any further as they approach the house. Just these three. And you'll often find as we go through this series, you'll find that Peter, James, and John get to see a few things that nobody else gets to see. They get to be there. The delay that stopped them from getting there kind of reminds me of the delay. Remember when Lazarus died? Jesus got the word. He said that Lazarus was sick, and it says he stayed a few extra days. And by the time he left, Lazarus had died. Jesus wasn't taken by surprise that Jairus' daughter had died. The fact that he had been delayed meant he had ministry. I mean, that happens to us sometimes, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes I'll have a week that's just one of those weeks, you know, with lots going on. You get a sermon on Sunday, everything else comes up, and then all of a sudden I get a call. Someone passed away, and they want me to do a funeral. On top of everything else. I've never turned down a funeral. I don't think ever in my life. Because it's an opportunity to minister. And at that point, I've just got to say, God, you know, you know everything I had to do before you sent me this funeral. So I'm going to do the funeral, and if I got a lot fewer hours to prepare for my Sunday sermon, you're just going to have to make it a lot better because it's not going to be dependent on me. And we have to look at our lives. When delays come and interruptions come, if God sends those interruptions our way, he's going to take care of us. And maybe there's a real important point on why he did. And maybe this delay was just so that daughter would die and Jairus would have a chance to say, am I really going to trust Jesus in this situation? So the scriptures talks about them going there, and they get to the house, as verse 38, and they came to the house of the synagogue official, and they beheld a commotion, people loudly weeping and wailing. Now, when a person dies, they used to hire professional wailers and weepers. Since this guy was a head official of the synagogue, you can imagine. I mean, if let's say something happened tragically in my family, you know, I mean, it would make a real big difference, you know, and you'd all probably surround us. I mean, we surround almost anybody, hopefully, in the church. But if the head official has a real tragedy, I mean, that affects everybody, and they're all ready to. And that's what happened here. Head official, his daughter just died. Everybody's there wailing, emotionally, and they've probably hired some people by the time. So a little bit of time has gone past, is what I'm saying, because she's had time to die. And for the professional wailers to get there, and the professional mourners, and now Jesus has arrived, so it's been a little bit. Also, if you look in one of the other texts, it says that there were flute players there, because that was traditional. You bring the flute players, and then they'd play these, you know, different, melodies and so forth that would go along with all the wailing and weeping, and you hear these high flute pitches coming, for the celebration of the person's death or the tragedy of the person's death. And I also wonder what Peter's thinking. Some people think, if you look in the history, it doesn't say in the scriptures that Peter had a daughter who was crippled. Don't know if she had her at that point, but remember, Peter is married. And so I'm thinking of Peter. What is he thinking as he sees Jairus there with his daughter? Maybe Peter has a daughter himself. Maybe he doesn't, but even so, I'm sure he's thinking, what would I be like? I'm married. That could be my kid. What's going to happen? I'm sure there's emotions going away as he walked in. And in Jesus, he says, and entering in, he said to them, verse 39, why make a commotion and weep? The child's not died, but is asleep. Now, was the child just in a coma, or was she really dead? She was dead. She was dead. Why did Jesus say she was asleep? What was his plan? He was going to raise her from the dead. So since he was going to raise her from the dead, she was just asleep. But she was dead. And the people knew it. The mourners would not be there. How many people have ever seen a person die or been with a person right after they died or seen a dead body? How many people? Okay, most of you. I was there with both my parents passed. I've been there through many of other people who passed through the church and so forth. And if you've not been there, you know that as soon as you're looking for that last breath, and maybe there's a breath, and there's a little while longer, then there's a breath. And then, boy, it's been a little while since the breath. And then they start turning yellowish. The jaundice comes through. And you know that they're really gone. And then it takes a while, and then their body gets a little cooler. And if you wait long enough, it eventually starts to get a little rigid, but in the beginning part, it's still fairly flexible. But if it's been there a while, after a while, it gets rigid, so they have a hard time. And I've been there where the funeral directors come to get the body, and they've had to really work at getting the person into the bag to take them out because they've started getting stiff. But the yellowish comes almost right away. These people knew that she was gone. She was dead. But Jesus Christ, she's still asleep. Will you believe me? And he sent them all out. And you know what they did? They laughed at him, it says. And they began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took the child's father and mother and his own companions, those 3 disciples, and he entered the room where the child was. And shaking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And here's this word immediately again. And immediately the girl rose and began to walk around, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. The disciples had never seen anybody raised from the dead before. This is the first time for them. We're told that Dwight L. Moody one time said, he had his first funeral he had to do, and so he said, well, let me go to the Bible and see if I can find one of Jesus' funeral sermons. That could be a good model to have, And he looked through, and he found that every time Jesus attended a funeral, he raised the person from the dead. So there was no funeral sermon he could use, because that was what happened with Jesus. But this is the first time, and it says they were totally astounded. And he gave them strict orders that they should tell no one about this, and he said that they should give her something to eat. He was concerned about her welfare. She'd been dying. She'd probably not eaten anything for a while, and maybe not had anything to drink. And so immediately said, take care of her, feed her, give her some water. I think this made a particular impression on Peter himself. Why? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, being a husband, I think he could relate to the father and mother sitting there looking at the daughter. I think it related because he was only one of 3. Can you imagine? I don't think I do this, but if I said, we're going to have a special thing happening tomorrow, I don't want you, and you to come with me. How would you feel? You were picked out of all the people, Peter, James, and John, the only 3. And he's standing there. I think he's thinking, why me? And what's happening? I've never seen this before. And then if you look at Acts chapter 9, verse 40, this is a number of years later, and you find Peter. There's a woman that dies named Dorcas. And as you read the passage, you find Peter does almost the exact same thing. He walks in, puts most of the people out of the room, takes her hand, and says, Dorcas, arise. And Peter, in the power of Jesus Christ, raises her from the dead. Almost the exact same scenario. So as I know that's coming up, I'm thinking, this has made a big impression on Peter. He's going to put this in the back of his mind and remember this forever. And I'm sure you would too if you went to a funeral and the person got raised from the dead. You'd probably remember for a long time. The principle I'd like to share is when people laugh, God still works miracles. When people laugh, God still works miracles. There was a person that was mentioned in one of John MacArthur, and I've never heard a funeral talk about this. The guy's name, just to give proper credit, was Arthur Brisbane, but he talked about the Christian funeral. And he said a Christian funeral is like a bunch of caterpillars all dressed in black suits carrying their deceased caterpillar friend in his cocoon to the new place where he's going to be laid to rest. I think you can see the picture. The cocoon, the caterpillar, dead, trapped. But soon, newness of life as the cocoon splits open and a beautiful butterfly comes out. And so it is with death. Death is like, for the Christian, it's like us taking the cocoon and putting it into someplace and waiting for the new life to come out of it. As we close this morning, how do you handle unexpected delays in your life? When things come up, you're so busy you can't take them. Or you have to be someplace on time and something delays you. How upset do you get? I'm trying to learn not to be upset, you know? I hate it when you get, the light's yellow, and should I go through or should I stop? And you stop, and then it's one of those lights that's 5 minutes long, Oh, I'm not one of the likes to just sit patiently and wait at red lights. They gotta wait here, But then I try to think, and occasionally it's happened. I wonder what happened down the road. I wonder if that 5-minute delay meant that I was 5 minutes later than I would have been. And that accident, and sometimes I've passed accidents that have recently taken place and wondered, if I hadn't gotten delayed, I wonder if that would have been me in that accident. Delays are sometimes divinely appointed. And are we willing to let God master those delays? And are we willing to allow him to direct our paths? And look for the opportunities that the delay brings. For me, it was, one of them was leaving the National Guard and going over to the reserves. Didn't want to do it. Last thing I wanted to do, plan to retire from the National Guard. Love the National Guard. The militia, Lexington, Concord, there's too many chaplains here of your rank. Maybe you should look for another spot. Devastating. Really devastating for me because I missed going out on a deployment because of that I trained for and trained my other chaplains for. And yet I got booted to another out of the reserves, and that's where I wound up getting promoted. Would have never gotten promoted had I stayed in the National Guard. Would have been a lieutenant colonel. Got to be in 06, got to go overseas, got to be a commander of a chaplain's unit. So many things happened because of that delay or that change that I didn't expect. Let's look just briefly as we close at the four people involved here. Jesus, how did he handle the delay? He saw it as another ministry opportunity for ministry, didn't he? To minister to the lady that was right there. He had his focus. He wanted to help Jairus, but there was a lady right here that needed his help, and so he didn't want to go past her too fast. He wanted to help that lady. And then he went on to the next assignment. Jairus, how did he handle the delay? Well, the delay was a time to increase his faith. Only believe. Now your daughter's dead. Now you really got to believe. He doesn't have to just speak her well. He's got to raise her from the dead, and you've never seen that before. Then there's Jairus' wife, who's not even mentioned in the text. I don't know if you can imagine a mother's heart. Can you imagine a mother, Jairus' wife? Remember, she didn't go with Jairus. So she's sitting by the bedside of her daughter, watching her, thinking, when is Jairus coming? When is he coming? What's the delay? How come it's taken him so long? Why can't he be here? And she watches her daughter die and then probably calls someone else and she's dead. Just tell Jairus to forget it. All this emotion going on in the mom's soul, and we don't even see it. She's not even mentioned here. And then finally, Peter, who wanted to know why Jesus would ask such a silly question, who touched me in a crowd? And then he witnessed the greatest miracle yet he'd ever seen. One which he would emulate years later. He was carefully watching everything Jesus did, even when he was asking him dumb questions. He was carefully watching and learning. And later on, when he became the main apostle, after Jesus has left this earth, a lot of this stuff affected his life. Our final theme for the day is this, if you're writing it down. People delays are often God's delays for greater things to come. People delays are often God's delays for greater things to come. Let's always look at a delay or something that goes wrong as an opportunity for present ministry or future development, or to increase our faith. Because as we're a believer, God has us always in his eyesight. Dear Lord, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for Peter's example here. We thank you for his dumb questions. We thank you for his outbursts. We thank you for his observations of what takes place. Help us to indeed take on delays like Jairus did and continue to have faith even when things go bad, that you are still totally in control. In Jesus' name, amen.